Hello, it is May 5th, 2022. Today we'll be discussing some of the longer term implications of the likely overturn of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court. This is As the World Burns, tying polls, prediction markets, and forecasting into current affairs and news. I'm your host, Randall Burns. And I'm going to try to be focused a little bit on topics that have not been covered much in the mainstream media. Now, this map is probably one you've seen where it goes into how state laws will change immediately afterwards. Now, the implicit assumption in this map is business as usual. I think that this case may not fit that presumption. And we're going to need to go into a little bit of background to explain that. There are two states, I think, that are key in looking at that map. One is Michigan, where the polls actually indicate that most Michigan voters oppose the Supreme Court decision. And we see similar polls in Florida that show the same thing, that most Floridian voters oppose the decision, yet Florida seems likely to ban abortion. Now, how can this be the case? Well, I would argue in part that money matters more than votes in the current U.S. political system. But that isn't to say that votes don't matter at all. Now, if you look at this map, it shows the states that have an initiative process. Florida and Michigan are both among them. That means that via a statewide campaign, an initiative can pass laws that might not get through the state legislature. Now, just how much would that cost? Well, back of the envelope suggests maybe $4 or $5 million for a state about the size of Michigan. A back of the envelope calculation suggests that's something that is within the potential budget of pro-choice organizations. This is actually a potentially winnable battle for them. Now, it might not happen until 2024, but there again, this is going to be an issue that might draw voters to the polls that might not otherwise come in an election year, where right now it looks unlikely the Democrats can pull a rabbit out of the hat and retain the presidency in 2024. This campaign might actually change that. But I'll also include a link to my past videos on the 2024 election prospects, just for reference. Now, one important thing to grasp is that in recent decades, Democrats have not paid that much attention to state legislature elections by comparison to federal elections. Real push has been to stave off exactly what happened by appointing Supreme Court judges, and that strategy has not worked. There's also been an issue of gerrymandering for U.S. federal elections, congressional elections. But there's been intense gerrymandering of states like Michigan and Wisconsin, and I would argue also Florida, to give the GOP an advantage in those state legislature elections. Now, again, in the state of Florida and in the state of Michigan, this can be changed via initiative. A lot of folks don't understand the inherent bias in the election system that the U.S. inherited from Britain. Now, what we actually wound up with has very little connection to what the founders actually intended. It's really kind of hard for someone to claim to be an originalist and consistently support the current election system. Now, there are some other implications there that I won't go into right now. I don't think the founders intended for the U.S. to be a pure democracy. They wanted to be more moderated democracy, but they did want the U.S. House of Representatives to be a highly democratic organization. Now, what they wanted in Republican institutions is a whole nother discussion. Now, a good window onto the current political landscape in the U.S. is Beyond Red and Blue by Pew. I respect their polling a great deal, and these are responsible polls by responsible organizations. A lot of people just don't have any idea what the real landscape, U.S. political landscape really is right now. And they don't have any idea how they fit into it or how it fits into major economic decision making. So I recommend that folks read this just to get some idea of what the current landscape is and what the degree of volatility is. And this is a good start. Now, I would argue that real electoral reform is what's needed to prevent this situation where you have state governments, and for that matter, federal governments, that are way out of line with what the population wants. I've seen cases, for example, where we had 80% of the population opposed to a law, and it got overridden by campaign donations to have 80% plus majorities in both houses of Congress. And no, I don't think this is an example of responsible Republican decision making. There's another topic on what that might be. I have seen libertarians arguing for a return to monarchy, which I think is kind of nutty. But one of the more sane folks from that genre is Robin Hanson. And this essay that Foodarchy, where he's talking about how to moderate democracy, I think deserves at least some consideration. And I think he's actually in line with the true Republican tradition, which is republicanism as a form of meritocracy. And he's arguing for predictability as a figure of merit. Now, breaking the two-party doom loop makes a case for electoral reform in the United States, and it can be applied to both the state and federal level. I think the state level is more realistic in the short term. And this issue of reproductive rights really might serve as a catalyst for some of the consideration on this one. Now, breaking the two-party doom loop goes into excruciating detail on the case in which electoral reform was achieved in New Zealand, which is a much smaller country than the U.S., but this is a case where it could be handled on a state-by-state basis. And in this case, Michigan is right next door to Canada, where electoral reform is a real issue. In fact, most of the Canadian population lives within a fairly short distance from Michigan. But I think that as Canada and the UK move to follow New Zealand's lead, Australia already has to a limited degree. This issue may heat up. And again, the reproductive rights issue is something that hits people in their daily life on a day-to-day basis. And they're going to start asking why government doesn't reflect what they want. So I think we're going to see a whole series of rather fierce state-by-state battles in this whole area. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out. I have submitted some meticulous questions on the state initiative issues. And I think that this will probably be part one of a series. I'll revisit it after those questions come live. Thank you very much for joining me today. Please do hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Comments are welcome, and I look forward to hearing from you, especially suggestions for future episodes.